The grand orbital station hung above the burning clouds of a red gas giant, a shining jewel of glass and steel, where the great powers of the galaxy gathered to speak of alliances, trade, and peace. It was here that the council hall stretched, in a wide arc, layered with balconies where envoys from dozens of species sat in shimmering robes, flowing uniforms, or strange organic suits shaped for their alien bodies. In the center, beneath a dome that reflected starlight, the human delegation had taken its modest place. Captain Darius Holt stood tall among them, his black uniform plain compared to the radiant attire of others, yet his presence carried an undeniable weight. Across the chamber, however, the star of the hour was not him, but Sarathia of the Veery, the Empire's chief diplomat, whose silver-scaled skin glimmered in the light and whose golden eyes surveyed the chamber with disdainful amusement. She was young for her kind, but carried herself with the certainty of someone born to power, someone who had never known failure. When the time came for her to speak, she rose with the grace of a predator, her voice amplified through the chamber, smooth yet edged like a blade. "We gather to consider," she began, "whether this new species, these humans, are worthy of any seat at this table. They speak of progress, of resilience, yet their history is littered with self-destruction, conflict, and primitive survival. Compared to the empires who have spanned the stars for millennia, what do they offer? What wisdom do they bring, save the noise of their endless wars?" A ripple of amusement spread through the chamber, subtle laughter and approving gestures from various alien envoys who found her words entertaining. Some nodded, others smirked, and the atmosphere shifted, carrying a sense of superiority over the quiet humans who stood stiffly under the scrutiny of the galaxy. Sarathia's words stung, but she continued, her confidence swelling as if she were dancing upon a stage where the audience adored her cruelty. "One must ask," she said, pausing as her gaze fell on Holt, "if this human captain truly believes his people belong here, or perhaps humanity has confused ambition with entitlement. After all, one does not invite children to sit among elders and expect wisdom to flourish." The laughter grew louder this time, ringing in the vaulted chamber, filling the air with mockery. Many eyes turned toward Holt, expecting him to rise in anger or defend his people with loud protests. But he did not move. He stood as still as stone, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. The silence he held only drew more amusement, as if his restraint was weakness. Sarathia tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing. She had expected fire, some spark of outrage, some burst of human temper to prove her point, but none came. Holt's silence unsettled her, though she masked it with a smile sharp enough to cut. She pressed forward. "Perhaps silence is their greatest gift," she mocked softly. "If so, it may be the first time humanity has discovered wisdom." Again the chamber filled with approving sounds. The alien delegations leaned closer, reveling in the display, while the human envoys sat rigid, their pride held together only by discipline. Holt remained the center of attention, and yet he gave nothing back. He did not flinch, he did not blink, and his stillness was more unnerving than if he had shouted. Sarathia felt the weight of his gaze, calm and cold, and for a moment her words faltered. It was brief, almost invisible, but she sensed that his silence was not weakness. It was something else, something deliberate, controlled, and far more dangerous than an outburst could ever be. She turned away sharply, letting her silver robes catch the light as she concluded. "The Veery Empire holds its stance. Humanity is not ready for the burdens of true diplomacy. Perhaps one day they will rise beyond their primitive instincts. But today, let us not pretend their place is equal to ours." She returned to her seat head high, basking in the murmurs of approval that washed through the chamber. Around her, delegates whispered, some openly amused, others doubtful, but all caught in the drama she had woven. Yet despite the apparent victory, she could not shake the image of Captain Holt's eyes upon her. They had not been angry. They had not been ashamed. They had been patient, calculating, as though he were waiting for a moment that had not yet come. As the session closed and the delegations dispersed, Sarathia felt a strange unease settle beneath her pride. She had humiliated humanity in front of the galaxy, yet she could not rid herself of the suspicion that she had walked into a trap she could not yet see. Holt, silent and still, left the chamber with the quiet dignity of a man who had lost nothing at all. In the laughter and mockery that lingered behind him, there was no sign of defeat, only the echo of a promise unspoken. The great orbital station never truly slept. Even when the council chambers emptied and the formal speeches faded, the vast hall still hummed with the lives of thousands of delegates, guards, traders, and workers moving through its glittering corridors. Light spilled from the crystalline ceilings, casting shifting patterns across the polished floors as if stars themselves were trapped inside. Yet within this beauty lurked shadows where whispers carried weight, and it was in such corners that fates often turned. Captain Darius Holt walked those halls in silence, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression steady as ever. But inside his mind ran sharp currents of thought. He had stood quietly when Sarathia mocked humanity, when laughter rippled across the chamber, but his silence was not born of defeat. It was a silence sharpened into a blade, and he knew patience often cut deeper than anger. Still, he was not blind to the danger. He understood the Veyari's influence across the galaxy, their ability to twist perception with nothing more than a speech. He also knew that humiliation in such a public forum had consequences, and those consequences would not only fall on him, but on the fragile position of humanity itself. Sarathia, meanwhile, returned to her private quarters high above the station's central spire, her silver robes trailing behind her as attendants bowed in quiet reverence. Yet even as she basked in her seeming triumph, there lingered in her thoughts the image of Holt's eyes, calm, still, unbroken. She had been praised before, showered with approval by her peers, yet this time something unsettled her. His silence had not been the silence of the defeated, but of a hunter waiting in the shadows. She dismissed it outwardly, telling herself he was powerless, but unease remained like a faint echo in the back of her mind. It was not long before their paths crossed again, though not in the polished chambers of the council. Late in the station's cycle, when most dignitaries rested, Holt moved quietly through one of the less-traveled sectors, a place where the station's brilliance gave way to steel supports and utility passageways. He walked alone, save for the faint hum of machines and the occasional flicker of lights. It was here, away from the gaze of the council, that truths were exchanged in shadows rather than on grand stages. As he turned a corner, he sensed movement. Figures stepped out from the dark, 3 tall forms cloaked in flowing garments that concealed more than they revealed. Their eyes glowed faintly, marking them as agents of one of the older races, mercenaries in the service of someone with wealth and intent. Captain Holt, the tallest among them said, their voice smooth yet laced with menace. You walk boldly where your kind is not welcome. Perhaps you should be reminded of your place. Holt said nothing, only regarded them with the same unshaken calm he had shown in the chamber. He did not reach for a weapon, though he carried one. Instead, he let silence answer them, and in that silence they faltered for a heartbeat. His reputation among humans was that of a man unyielding, but here, far from witnesses, the test was sharper. The mercenaries stepped closer, their robes shifting to reveal the glint of hidden blades and energy pistols. Humanity thinks itself clever, the second hissed. But you should know. Some among this council will not allow you to rise. Our employers ensure it. Better to bow quietly, now than to be broken later. Before Holt could speak, another voice cut through the dim corridor, sharp and commanding. Enough. From the shadows emerged Sarathia herself, her golden eyes glowing faintly in the low light. Her attendants trailed nervously behind, surprised to find her there, yet her presence was not accidental. She had followed him. The mercenaries immediately lowered their weapons, bowing slightly, though unease flickered across their features. Sarathia's gaze fell on them with irritation. Did I instruct you to interfere? She demanded. Do you imagine I require your petty intimidation to deal with one human envoy? Her words were soft but deadly, and the mercenaries backed away, their confidence bleeding out under her scorn. With a flick of her hand, she dismissed them, and reluctantly, they melted back into the shadows of the station's hidden paths. Now only she and Holt remained, the silence between them stretching. Taut, she studied him, her lips curving slightly in something that was not quite a smile. You walk alone in dangerous places, Captain, she said, her tone low. Perhaps you seek danger, or perhaps you think your silence will shield you even. Here, Holt regarded her with the same calm as before. His voice, when it came, was steady, quiet, and carried no tremor. I do not seek danger, but I do not fear it either. And silence is not my shield, it is my weapon. For the first time, Sarathia laughed, though it was not the laughter of mockery she had used before. It was sharper, edged with curiosity. A weapon? Silence? You amuse me, human. Do you think this galaxy will bend because you refuse to speak? He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers, his voice still calm. It is not the galaxy I intend to bend, Ambassador. Only those who believe silence means weakness. The air between them grew heavy. Sarathia felt the strange pull of his words, the steady fire behind them. And though she stood taller and carried the pride of her empire, she could not shake the feeling that this man was not what he seemed. For the first time, doubt whispered. Within her arrogance, a whisper she quickly silenced. You play a dangerous game, Captain, she said at last, her tone cool, one that may cost you more than you know. Holt's reply was simple, almost too soft to hear. Danger is where humanity was born. We are no strangers to it. She turned sharply, her silver robe swirling as she began to leave, though her steps were slower than before, as if she carried something heavier than pride. Holt watched her go, his expression unchanged, but in his mind, he marked the encounter carefully. He had seen her arrogance falter, even if only for a heartbeat, and that was enough. He knew the cracks in armor often began as small as a single word, or a silence that could not be ignored. As the hum of the station returned around him, Holt walked deeper into the shadows, patient as ever. The game had begun, and though Sarathia believed herself the one in control, she had already stepped onto a path from which there would be no easy return. The dangerous encounter had not ended. It had only lit the spark of a storm that would soon engulf them both. The council chambers buzzed with unease the following cycle, though no one admitted it openly. Rumors drifted like smoke through the station's halls, of mercenaries seen near the human envoy, of sharp words exchanged in the shadows, and of Sarathia herself being sighted far from the glittering spire where her kind usually remained. Diplomats whispered behind closed doors, trading pieces of truth and fragments of lies until no one could tell which was which. Yet amid this swirl of suspicion, one fact remained. The human envoy still walked with the same measured calm, and the Vayari diplomat's arrogance carried a faint edge that had not been there before. For Captain Holt, these whispers were not distractions but tools. He had always known that battles were rarely won by strength alone. They were won by perception, by shifting the balance of who was seen as strong and who as weak. Humanity's survival on the galactic stage depended not on weapons alone but on respect or fear, and now he saw a path forming. Still, he understood he could not walk it alone. In a place where alliances decided fates, he needed a partner, though the thought of who that partner might be would have startled even the most cynical mind. The chance came sooner than he expected. He was summoned not to a grand chamber but to a small, dimly lit conference room deep in the lower levels of the station, far from the elegance of the upper spires. The message had come unsigned, but Holt recognized the pattern of its phrasing, direct, controlled, almost sharp enough to cut. When the door slid open, Sarathia was already inside, standing tall with her arms folded, the faint glow of her eyes catching the light. She did not greet him with the sneer she had worn before, nor with the mocking tone that had once drawn laughter from her peers. Instead, she regarded him in silence for a long moment, as though measuring the air between them. "You came," she said finally, her voice lacking the disdain it once carried. "I was invited," Holt replied, his tone calm but cautious. He did not sit until she gestured, and even then, he lowered himself slowly as though the chair were part of a battlefield rather than a simple piece of furniture. For a time, Neither spoke. The low hum of the station filled the silence, and Holt waited, knowing patience often unraveled others faster than questions did. Sarathia broke first, though not with arrogance. "Your people intrigue me," she said slowly. "You are weaker than most who sit at the council table. Your fleet's smaller, your colonies fewer. And yet—" She paused, her golden eyes narrowing, as if trying to pierce through his steady calm. "You stand as though none of that matters. You do not flinch when mocked. You do not yield when threatened. I find myself wondering if humanity's true strength is not in what it possesses, but in what it endures." Holt did not smile, though the words struck closer to truth than she realized. "Endurance is the only weapon given to us freely," he answered quietly. "Everything else we've had to build with our own hands." Her lips curved, though it was not the cruel smile she had worn before. It was something closer to curiosity, perhaps even respect. "Endurance," she repeated softly, almost to herself. Then her tone hardened. "I did not summon you here to exchange philosophies. I summoned you because the tides are shifting and you are too clever to ignore it. There are forces on this station, old alliances, silent agreements that seek to shape outcomes long before votes are cast. Some would see humanity pushed aside permanently. Others," she let the word linger like smoke, "others would use you and by extension use me. I will not be anyone's tool." Holt leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "And you think an alliance with humanity will prevent that?" She met his gaze without blinking. "I think you and I have both been marked. You because you dared to stand in silence when I humiliated you. That silence was not forgotten. It unsettled them more than anger would have. And I, because I showed curiosity toward you when I should have dismissed you entirely. To them, that is weakness." Her voice sharpened, but not against him. "If we continue alone, we will both be targeted. By whispers, by sabotage, by shadows sent to remind us of our place. But together, perhaps we can turn their eyes elsewhere." For the first time, Holt allowed the faintest trace of a smile. "You spent an entire session mocking humanity, and now you ask for its hand." Her eyes flashed, but instead of anger, there was something like defiance. Not toward him, but toward the world that expected her to remain untouchable. "I do not ask lightly, Captain, do not mistake me. This is not an apology, nor is it surrender, it is strategy. Alone you are dismissed. Alone I am envied and resented. Together—" She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Together, we become unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous." Holt studied her, weighing each word, testing its strength. He had no illusions about trust. Sarathia was proud, cunning, and still saw humanity as something lesser. Yet he also recognized the truth in what she said. Isolation was death in places like this. If survival required standing beside an enemy, then so be it, so long as both understood the rules. "Very well," he said at last. "An alliance, but temporary, and built on need, not sentiment." Her smile returned, sharper this time, but with a glint of satisfaction. "Agreed." From that moment, a strange new current began to flow through the station. Observers noted that the once hostile Vayari diplomat now lingered near the human envoy, her tone softer, her words less cruel. They saw Holt walking calmly at her side, unflinching, even as others whispered in disbelief. Speculation spread like wildfire. Was this alliance born of strategy or something deeper? No one knew, and that uncertainty became its own weapon. Other delegations grew restless, old alliances faltered, and unseen hands began to move in desperate response. In the grand game of power, perception had shifted, and Holt knew the danger would only grow sharper from here. But for the first time since the humiliation in the chamber, he also knew that humanity was no longer walking this battlefield alone. The great council chamber was alive with tension as the delegations gathered once more, the ceiling alive with streams of starlight from the station's massive viewports. But beneath that beauty ran an undercurrent of unease that few dared to voice aloud. Whispers darted like shadows from table to table as representatives speculated on the sudden and unexpected alliance between Captain Darius Holt and Sarathia of the Vayari, a union that made little sense to those who only judged by pride and rivalry, but made perfect sense to those who saw how much influence perception alone could wield. It was not long before Holt noticed subtle changes in the way eyes followed him, no longer with casual dismissal but with caution. While Sarathia too carried herself differently, her sharp tongue kept in check, not out of humility but because she knew silence, when deliberate, could be sharper than insult. Yet if some watched them with wary curiosity, others observed with a far darker purpose, and as the counselors settled into their seats, the first sign of the trap began to appear. A motion was brought to the floor by a minor faction, one that seldom carried weight, demanding a vote on whether humanity should be allowed full access to the trade corridors of the Orion Arm, an opportunity too rich to ignore, but framed so carefully that it dripped with poison. For if humanity voted in favor, as they must, it would appear as overreach, a greedy grab that others could use to paint them as reckless newcomers. And if they refused, they would appear timid and undeserving of any influence at all. Holt recognized the maneuver instantly, but what unsettled him was the ease with which it was presented, as though carefully rehearsed, suggesting someone had planned this long before his alliance with Sarathia had been made public. He remained still, his eyes scanning the chamber, while Sarathia's voice, clear and commanding, cut through the murmurs as she demanded clarification on the terms of the motion. Her question forced the minor faction speaker into an awkward pause, and Holt realized with quiet satisfaction that she had not only understood the trap, but was already moving to unravel it. Yet unraveling would not be easy, for the faction leader, emboldened by unseen support, pressed forward with an almost smug confidence, claiming that the corridors were being endangered by piracy, and that only select species had the stability to guard them properly, species which conveniently did not include humanity. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber, and Holt could almost hear the strings of manipulation pulling from behind the scenes. He knew that the true architects of this trap were not the small faction standing before them, but the greater powers hiding in the shadows, content to let others play the role of mouthpiece while they reap the advantage. The choice was clear: step into the snare and lose, or find a way to turn the very mechanics of the trap against its makers. Holt rose slowly, every motion deliberate, his figure dwarfed by the towering alien envoys around him, yet his voice carried, with steady resolve. He spoke not of humanity's rights nor its ambitions, but of the principle at stake, reminding the chamber that the corridors were not the property of any one faction, but the lifeblood of all. If piracy was a threat, then it was a threat to every world that relied upon those roots, and thus to divide responsibility was to weaken the defense itself. His words were calm, almost unremarkable on the surface, but carried an edge of reason that made dismissal dangerous, for to oppose him now meant to oppose stability itself. Some shifted uneasily, yet the trap was not so easily escaped, for the faction leader retorted that humans had no fleet large enough to patrol those corridors, no standing force to offer, and that granting them equal footing would be a burden rather than a boon. The words hung heavy in the chamber, and Holt allowed the silence to linger, knowing that the next voice would not be his. It came from Sarathia. Rising with her regal bearing, she announced that the Vayari, though often critical of human methods, had observed their endurance firsthand and would gladly share patrol duties with them, pairing human adaptability with Vayari precision. Gasps broke the silence, for such an offer was unprecedented, and Holt, though outwardly impassive, felt the weight of what she had done. By tying her people's name to humanity's cause, she had shattered the carefully laid plan of those who sought to isolate him, forcing the chamber to rethink the motion entirely. The faction leader faltered, their confidence slipping as they realized the trap had shifted. For now to deny humanity was to insult the Vayari, one of the Council's most respected powers. Whispers erupted louder than before, some in outrage, others in astonishment, but all carried the same truth. The balance had tilted, and not in the way the architects of the trap had intended. Yet Holt knew better than to believe the battle was won. The shadowed powers behind the faction would not simply abandon their designs because one motion had failed. Instead, they would grow more desperate, more ruthless, and the very fact that Sarathia had stepped forward to bind her name to humanity meant she too had painted a target on her back. He saw it in the flicker of eyes across the chamber, the measured way some delegations now regarded her with cold calculation, as though already planning how to punish her defiance. When the vote was finally cast, the motion collapsed under its own weight, stripped of purpose by her declaration, and the council adjourned in restless disorder. But the air that lingered was not relief. It was anticipation of storms to come. As Holt walked with Sarathia through the winding corridors after the session, neither spoke at first, their silence heavy with unspoken truths. At last she glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but her tone edged with quiet certainty. "They will come harder now. You know this." "I know," Holt replied, his voice steady though his thoughts turned toward the unseen hands that had nearly closed around them. "But traps lose their power when you know they're there. The danger is the ones we cannot see." For a moment, she regarded him, and then with a faint curve of her lips she said, "Then we will make ourselves the storm they cannot predict." And with those words, Holt realized that whatever schemes their enemies wove in the dark, an even more dangerous alliance was being forged in the open, one that no trap could contain forever. The station never truly slept, its endless corridors, glowing with artificial light. But beneath the hum of engines and the steady rhythm of commerce, there were places where shadows ruled, and it was in those places that the unseen war began to stir. Captain Darius Holt had long learned to listen for the small details. The misplaced maintenance drone, the flicker of cameras where they should not, the patterns of movement that betrayed more than simple chance. And in the days following the council's vote, he began to notice that nothing happened without intent. Doors that once opened smoothly for his clearance now hesitated a half-second longer, not enough to be suspicious to anyone else, but enough for him to sense interference. Rumors of sabotage drifted quietly among the crews docked at the station, whispered tales of supply freighters being diverted, communication relays failing at precise times, and security patrols being rerouted just as thefts occurred. These incidents were dismissed as the usual chaos of such a massive hub, but Holt's instincts screamed that they were connected, threads of a larger design aimed at undermining not only humanity, but anyone aligned with it. And indeed, Sarathia herself felt the weight of it, for her quarters were breached not by force but by subtle tampering, systems rewritten so her environmental controls nearly failed in the dead of night, an attack designed not to kill, but to remind her that her defiance had been noticed. She had woken to the chill of thinning air, eyes narrowing as she realized the trap was not within the council chamber alone but in every corner of their lives. Rather than retreat in fear, Holt chose to move forward, and so he began to track, the saboteurs in silence piecing together clues as though he were following ghosts. He found fragments of erased data, the kind that most would overlook, but Holt knew that true invisibility was impossible when the station systems were designed to record everything. In those gaps, he saw a pattern, timed disruptions that always preceded major council sessions, as though someone was laying groundwork to discredit humanity by engineering failure around them. When an entire human supply convoy was falsely flagged as carrying contraband and nearly seized at the docks, Holt knew he had uncovered the enemy's strategy. They wanted not only to isolate him politically, but to tarnish the reputation of every human ship to make them appear unreliable, dangerous, unworthy of trust. Yet there was a deeper twist, for in each disruption, he also found traces of technology that did not match the minor faction who had spoken against him in council. This was the work of a more advanced hand, one powerful enough to remain hidden while others played the role of pawns. Sarathia, though furious at the invasion into her personal chambers, remained collected, and together with Holt, she proposed a dangerous plan. They would stage a vulnerability of their own, setting bait for the saboteurs to see who emerged from the shadows to strike. Holt knew it was risky, for it meant putting real assets on the line, but it was the only way to draw the unseen enemy into the light. They arranged for a coded transmission to announce that a small human diplomatic courier, carrying sensitive treaty drafts, would be left lightly guarded in one of the docking bays. In truth, the ship carried nothing of importance, but its appearance as a vulnerable target was designed to be irresistible. For 3 days they waited, outwardly carrying on as though nothing had changed, but Holt felt the pressure in the silence, the way the corridors seemed too quiet, the way their allies grew cautious as rumors of plots spread. He knew the enemy was watching them, studying every step, waiting for the right moment. When the attack came, it was swift and precise. The docking bay's surveillance feeds were looped with flawless execution, and a team of cloaked infiltrators slipped into the hangar like shadows. But Holt was ready. From a hidden vantage point, he watched as the figures moved with professional discipline, their weapons sleek, their tools not those of common thieves, but of a military force accustomed to infiltration. He and Sarathia exchanged a glance, and with a silent command the trap was sprung. Hidden drones surged from the corners of the hangar, their lights flashing as they pinned the intruders in beams of energy. For a moment it seemed victory was theirs until the infiltrators activated a strange device that released a wave of distortion, knocking out the drones and plunging the bay into chaos. Holt fought through the confusion, tackling one of the saboteurs and tearing away their mask, only to find a face not of the minor faction, but of the Cathari Dominion, a power far greater and more dangerous, one that had publicly remained neutral in all council disputes. That revelation hit him harder than the struggle itself, for it meant the sabotage was not a random act of hostility, but a calculated move by one of the galaxy's most cunning empires. The Cathari were masters of subtle warfare, known to erode their enemies not through open battle but through corruption and collapse from within. To discover them here was to realize that every shadow on the station, every hesitation in its systems, every whisper of sabotage was part of a larger strategy to weaken both humans and their new allies, until they collapsed, without a shot fired. The infiltrators fought viciously, but Holt's determination and Sarathia's sharp precision forced them into retreat, though not before one escaped with a fragment of stolen data. As alarms blared and security forces rushed in too late to be useful, Holt stood in the wreckage, the truth burning in his mind. The council chamber was only the stage, and the real war was being fought in silence, in sabotage, in whispered lies and unseen knives. That night, as the station returned to its uneasy calm, Holt and Sarathia met in a secluded observation deck, the stars stretching endlessly beyond the glass. "They know we are watching now," she said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes sharp with fire. "And they will not forgive us for tearing away their mask." Holt nodded, his jaw tight, for he understood the weight of what had begun. The Cathari Dominion had chosen to reveal themselves not in words but in action, and that meant the game was no longer about reputation alone. It was about survival. Yet beneath the tension, Holt felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, for by springing their trap they had turned hunters into the hunted, and now they carried knowledge that few in the council could claim. Still, he knew the shadows were far from finished, and if the Dominion was willing to risk exposure, then their next move would be even more dangerous. As the lights of the station glimmered against the void, Holt allowed himself a single thought. The enemy had made the first strike in the shadows, but the storm had only just begun, and humanity would not be so easily broken. The revelation of the Cathari Dominion's involvement changed everything, for where once the council had believed the conflict to be a petty squabble among lesser factions, it was now clear that an empire of old power and cunning had entered the game. And when the Cathari moved, they did so with layers of intent so deep that few could discern where the deception ended and the truth began. Captain Darius Holt understood this the moment the council convened in a closed chamber, the air thick with unease as delegates whispered in distrustful clusters, for though Sarathia spoke of what they had uncovered, presenting the captured infiltrator, as evidence the Cathari representative sat calm and amused, his silvered eyes reflecting no hint of concern. He denied all charges with practiced ease, suggesting the intruders were merely opportunists using stolen technology, and then, with subtle skill, he turned suspicion back upon humanity itself, asking how convenient it was that Holt and Sarathia had miraculously uncovered such an incident without loss, how unusual that the data lost in the skirmish had never been verified, and how dangerous it was for the Council to allow humans to manufacture crises for sympathy. The words struck like daggers, and Holt saw the hesitation bloom in those who were already uncertain. For the Dominion had not come to defend itself. They had come to twist the narrative into a weapon, and every diplomat in the room was its potential victim. What followed was a campaign so precise that Holt could only admire its cruelty. The Cathari began leaking falsified reports across the station's information channels, whispering of human traitors cheating their partners, hinting at secret human warships hidden in deep space, painting Holt not as a defender of truth but as an ambitious manipulator, seeking to destabilize the balance of power. Even Sarathia found herself dragged into their trap, accused of abandoning the pride of her own people to serve human interests, her every word twisted into evidence of weakness. It was not brute force the Dominion used, but the slow suffocation of lies. And within days their influence spread like smoke, seeping into every corner of the station until allies no longer knew who to trust. Holt, however, refused to be broken by whispers, and instead of trying to shout over them, he sought to uncover the deeper pattern, for he knew the Dominion did nothing without a purpose beyond what was seen. He studied the failures of power, grids that always seemed to occur before council votes, the quiet bribes that left supply chains disrupted, the sudden arrival of Cathari merchants who carried wares that undercut human goods so perfectly that it seemed orchestrated, and in the chaos of these small acts he saw the outline of the greater plan. The Dominion was not merely trying to discredit humanity. They were laying the foundation to seize control of the station itself, to turn this crossroads of trade and diplomacy into their own stronghold by engineering division until the Council begged them to restore order. To allow that to happen would mean not only humanity's isolation, but the eventual enslavement of all who relied on this hub. Holt shared his findings with Sarathia late in the night, their voices low as the stars drifted silently outside the viewport, and though anger burned in her, she understood that anger alone was useless against such an enemy. Together they resolved not to fight the Dominion openly, for such a battle would be lost before it began, but to mirror their methods, to plant seeds of truth as the Cathari planted lies, to expose not through accusation, but through undeniable evidence. Yet the risk was staggering. For every move they made was watched, every ally they whispered to might already be compromised, and the Dominion's hand grew bolder with each day, orchestrating a riot among dock workers, planting false signals in the communications relays to mimic human war codes, and even arranging a staged explosion in a maintenance tunnel that conveniently implicated Holt's security team. Trust eroded faster than Holt could rebuild it, and the Council prepared to vote on emergency powers that, if granted to the Dominion, would cement their control beyond challenge. The night before the vote, Holt stood in the observation dome, staring into the abyss of stars, knowing that humanity's future balanced on the edge of a knife, and it was then that Sarathia joined him, her tone quieter than he had ever heard it, admitting that for the first time she feared her own people might yield to Dominion pressure rather than stand with him. Holt's reply was simple but steady. Then we give them a reason to believe again. The next day, as the council chamber filled with voices ready to condemn, Holt stood and spoke, not with anger but with clarity, revealing fragments of data. He had risked everything to gather. The Dominion's hidden signals traced to encrypted channels, proof of resource manipulation, and the intercepted orders of their infiltrators. It was not enough to end the threat, but it was enough to fracture their perfect mask, to force doubt upon the once untouchable Cathari. The Dominion's representative smiled still, but Holt saw the subtle stiffness in his posture, the sign of a predator unaccustomed to being wounded. The battle was far from won, yet in that moment Holt understood that survival was possible, not through power alone but through relentless resolve, and that the Dominion's counterstrike, no matter how precise, had revealed the truth of their fear. Humanity's voice, once ignored, could no longer be silenced. The council chamber, once a place of formal speeches and measured diplomacy, had become an arena of raw tension, its vaulted ceilings echoing not with reasoned debate but with the rising storm of distrust and fear that the Dominion had cultivated so carefully. Yet for the first time the certainty of their dominance faltered, for Captain Darius Holt had, forced open cracks in their perfect facade, and through those cracks light was beginning to shine. Still, victory was not assured, for the Dominion's representative, a tall figure cloaked in shimmering gray, responded not with desperation but with calm precision, weaving words that dripped with venomous charm, suggesting that Holt's so-called evidence was a fabrication, a desperate attempt by humanity to slander a noble empire out of jealousy. And there were many in the chamber who wanted to believe it, for to acknowledge the truth meant admitting they had been manipulated, that they had been played for fools. Holt knew this moment would decide everything, and he could not simply stand against the Dominion with cold facts alone. He needed to strike where their arrogance left them blind. As Sarathia watched him, her once proud expression now tempered. With a quiet resolve, Holt made his gamble, not by accusing, not by shouting, but by inviting, offering the Dominion a chance to open their encrypted trade logs before the Council, to allow every member to see the transparency of their dealings. The silence that followed was electric, for the challenge was clever. If the Dominion refused, suspicion would fester, and if they accepted, the truth risked exposure. The representative smiled thinly, masking the hesitation, but that hesitation was seen, and Holt knew then that he had struck the mark. The Council began to murmur, some emboldened by Holt's calm defiance, others uncertain, and sensing their grip slipping. The Dominion chose escalation. With a subtle signal, hidden devices embedded throughout the station flickered to life, disrupting power conduits, silencing communication relays, and plunging half the chamber into a haze of failing lights and sparking consoles. The move was meant to create panic, to frame humanity as saboteurs in the chaos. But instead it revealed too much, for Sarathia had anticipated such treachery and had arranged hidden recorders in the ventilation grids, devices small enough to escape notice, yet powerful enough to capture the Dominion's transmission codes in real time. As chaos erupted, Holt activated the relay, projecting the intercepted codes across the Council chamber for all to see. The effect was like a blade cutting through a veil, the Dominion's secrets exposed not through accusation, but undeniable, proof their own sabotage turned against them in the most public of ways. Gasps echoed as the Council members realized the deception that had ensnared them, the manipulation that had nearly stripped them of their freedom, and in that instant the Dominion's silence was more damning than any defense they could muster. Yet even cornered, they were dangerous. The representative, realizing the mask was broken, abandoned words and attempted to flee, signaling to hidden operatives who rose from the shadows armed with concealed weapons, their mission no longer to manipulate but to silence. The chamber dissolved into a storm of movement, delegates scattering, guards clashing with Dominion agents, and amidst it all, Holt and Sarathia stood back to back, fighting not for survival alone, but for the principle that had brought them to this moment, that truth mattered and that unity could not be broken by lies. Sparks rained from the ceiling as blasts of energy fire ripped through the ornate walls, and in the chaos, Holt managed to seize the Dominion's data core from the representative, a crystalline device humming with encrypted layers, its capture symbolizing not just evidence but a weapon of hope. With the device in his grasp, he broadcast the stored Dominion orders to every ship docked at the station, ensuring that even if he fell, the truth would live. And as the wave of information spread like wildfire, the Dominion's web unraveled in full view of the galaxy. Reinforcements loyal to the Council surged in, overwhelming the Dominion operatives, and at last the representative was dragged before the assembly, his arrogance stripped away, his silence now the only defense he could muster. When order was restored, the chamber bore scars of the conflict, shattered glass, scorched walls, frightened faces, but also something new, something Holt had feared was lost: unity. Delegates from rival species spoke not in suspicion, but in shared outrage, pledging to resist the Dominion's shadow together. And for the first time in generations, humanity was not seen as weak or expendable, but as a catalyst, a voice that had reminded them all of the cost of complacency. Sarathia stood at Holt's side, no longer mocking, no longer proud for the sake of pride, but carrying a respect that words could not disguise, for she had seen him face not only the Dominion, but the weight of an entire council, and he had not faltered. As the Council voted to strip the Dominion of influence, banishing their fleets from the station, Holt looked upon the assembly and knew the fight was far from over, for empires like the Dominion did not fall in a single day. But what mattered was that a line had been drawn, one that would not be crossed again so easily. Humanity had not merely survived, it had shaped the turning of an age. And though the stars beyond still carried dangers unimagined, Holt believed with certainty that the echo of this reckoning would resound across the galaxy, a reminder that no empire, however vast, could silence those who dared to stand against them.